Welcome to this episode of A New Springtime, which is focusing on the women doctors of the church. Today, we have Father Stephen, who is a Carmelite priest here in LA, and he's actually going to be celebrating his 40th anniversary of his priesthood this year. And he served all over the world, including in Uganda, where he just came back from. So thanks, Father Stephen, for joining us about Saint Teresa of Avila today.
Most happy to be with you, Krista. And by the way, I came back from Uganda on a short visit. I was assigned there for a couple of years, but I didn't. I've been assigned to St. Teresa's Parish in El Hamra for since August.
Oh, wow. Welcome. I didn't realize it was so recent.
Yeah, I was 6 years in Tucson and came
Oh,
over last
wow.
August.
Great. Well, welcome. Father, assuming the listener doesn't know anything about St. Teresa of Avila, and I'm sure it's difficult to even summarize her life, can you tell us a little bit about who she was, how she lived her life?
Saint Teresa was born in Avila, Spain in March of 1515, and she was educated in what was at that time girls' schools and the convents. And she didn't have any intention of becoming a nun. In fact, she was rather repulsed by the idea of becoming a nun. And she's very funny when she speaks about that because she realized that was her vocation. She realized that she should embrace it for the salvation of her soul. She didn't want to go to hell. And that may not be the most appealing reason for somebody to take a vocation, but that's sort of the mentality of the time. But she was very vivacious and loved by all. She had a great gift of friendship. Anyhow, she joined the monastery of the Incarnation, which is actually outside the walls. It still exists today, outside the walls of Avila. Avila is a famous city because of it's a walled city, like Assisi and other cities in Europe in the Middle Ages, particularly in Spain, because they had centuries of fighting the Muslims, who occupied the Iberian Peninsula for so many centuries. And so she came from a family, she had seven brothers. All seven of her brothers went to the New World, as it was called. They didn't all go on the same ship at the same time, but eventually all of them ended up over there. Some of them died there. Two brothers in particular came back, and one brother that she was very close to, who she hadn't seen for 34 years, becomes a very close um, confidant of hers at the end of her life. But anyway, she was in a big monastery. There were over 100 women in that monastery, and it wasn't, all that monastic. She had a servant, for instance, and they could come and go. They were good women. There wasn't any, accusations of immorality or anything like that, but it just wasn't as conducive to the life of prayer that she eventually felt more and more drawn to. So she had kind of an up and down relationship with the Lord, a roller coaster ride, as it were, because she was constantly with friends from the world in the parlor and visiting, and then she'd get these invitations from the Lord that were becoming more and more intense and even mystical. And finally, she has a kind of a conversion experience. She's already at this point in her mid-30s. She makes a kind of a once and for all commitment, and things really do change for her after that. She wasn't in the monastery very long as a young woman when she had a very mysterious illness that actually paralyzed her. At first, she went out of the monastery to a special place where they had treatments, not very scientific treatments, and it didn't work, and she got worse. And actually, she was thought to be dead. She went into kind of a comatose state. They had actually dug a grave for her.
Wow.
I mean, it's amazing to think about it. They realized, well, she really isn't dead. Maybe her eye twitched or something, thanks be to God. And so she slowly recovered, but she was very paralyzed. And it wasn't until she went to St. Joseph that she really experienced a full healing. And ever after, she was very devoted to St. Joseph. She was a great promoter of St. Joseph. Her prayer life intensified. She had Dominican directors. Eventually, she met some Jesuits, some very young Jesuits, much younger than she was, but the Jesuits were a new order in the church, and they really helped her tremendously. And the Lord inspired her to make a foundation outside of the Incarnation, which comes to be known as St. Joseph's. And that's the beginning of the reform. I'm sort of reluctant to call it a reform because she wasn't trying to clean up everybody's act. She was actually trying to start something new under the inspiration of the Lord. And she wanted a small community where everybody could be friends, everybody would know each other and support each other, and most of all, that they would be totally committed to a life of prayer. So there was an emphasis on cloister, which the incarnation did not have. At the same time, we should remember that the Tridentine reforms were taking place throughout the church, and a lot of religious orders were going through movements of reformation. So often, what Teresa is characterized as a reform, and yes and no, it certainly was in that era of the church, which we call the counter reformation. But we also have to see a newness. It wasn't just a recreating the perfect past, restoring, something and, leaving it that. She really did bring something new to Carmel and to the church. Eventually, she recruited St. John of the Cross, and he becomes the first friar, and he's often portrayed next to her as the male Carmelite, collaborating with her. It's not exactly like that, but it is true that he was the first, and she did recruit him. And it is true that we look to her as the foundress of the friars too, which is unusual, for having a woman considered as a founder. And not all the Spanish friars looked at her like that.
Mm.
That macho thing, they didn't really feel all that comfortable, I guess. She was fine for the nuns, but the men, they had somebody else. And they eventually, that's why St. John of the Cross gets elevated to be the figure that represents the male reform. But even that's a simplification of what actually was going on. And it's too complicated to explain it in a podcast. But I don't know if that's enough of an introduction for you, but she was born in 1515. She died in 1582. She lived during the Counter Reformation Spain. There were many illustrious saints of her time, and she had converse with some who became doctor of the church. I mentioned St. John of the Cross. More recently, John of Avila has been given the title Doctor of the Church. She also was guided by him, but she was guided by St. Francis Borgia and other illustrious men of the time. And one interesting thing is, except for, as I mentioned, John of the Cross and John of Avila, she had so many learned men that she went to for direction, but she's the one who becomes the doctor of the church. Those other men are somewhat forgotten. Most Catholics wouldn't know anything about those people, but we remember her. She really did rely on the guidance of spiritual directors. She did not presume to be learned or wise or anything, although she recognized that God was doing something with her, but she was always getting guidance from the church and from the ministers of the church, that is to say, the priests of the church of her time. But she's the one who emerges above them all as the teacher who's teaching the church to this day.
Yeah, and that's the thing about this the goal of this podcast is that the doctors of the church are actually great teachers for everyday people, not just religious or consecrated people, that there's something they particularly have to teach us, and that's why the church has elevated them to doctors of the church. They're the most accessible out of all the saints, maybe because they're giving something fresh to the church that we could all learn from. So thank you for that great rundown of her life. There are a couple things I want to highlight in the things that you were just saying. Maybe we can start with the fact that that guidance perspective, that she was relying on the spiritual directors from the church. And you mentioned that she was learning from the Jesuits about prayer. At first, she was learning from the Jesuits. So, what's something that she learned from them that you think maybe she added on to it whenever, like, we're going a little bit more into her teaching after that, like the interior castle and things like that? So, what was something for her that was maybe foundational that she ended up adding onto?
Well, you often hear that what's sort of quintessential in her presentation of prayer is Christ as our companion and friend. So friendship with Christ. So the most oft quoted definition of prayer from her life is prayer is nothing, mental prayer is nothing other than a heart to heart conversation with one whom we know loves us and with whom we spend time alone. Now, in the Spanish, it's tratar de amistad. And that word, that verb tratar is, it's rendered in different ways, and it's a rather, rich verb in the sense that it's not just merely a conversation. It even could be referring to a love relationship or something. It's a very special kind of a friendship. But that's her simple definition. Um, what did she add to it? There's so many there, when you study the saints, they all have this wonderful relationship with Christ. Some of them are gifted to be able to speak about it, and teach about it. And Teresa was one of those. She came to understand and be able to convey. And she actually says that she recognizes that as a gift of the Lord, that the Lord wanted her to, as it were, expound on this interior life. Her ability to write about it is one great thing. And she did have her own way of presenting it, of course, which is what distinguishes her among other writers of the spiritual life. One of her most famous works is The Interior Castle, which was written, for a larger audience. All of her writings were written under obedience to spiritual directors. The first work is the life of Saint, her life, and it was her spiritual director says, I think you need to write this down. What's happening is very extraordinary, and we'd like to have you explain it more. I don't know exactly what the spiritual director was thinking, and there was more than one involved because the work wasn't written overnight. It was written over a period of time. But it was one in particular that asked her to write it. It's an amazing, exposition of her life. It's a little bit like St. Augustine's Confessions, in the sense it's a story of her conversion, how she comes close to Christ. But then, like the Confession of St. Augustine, it gets into a mode of teaching, not what Augustine was teaching, but it goes into a more spiritual mode of explaining things about the interior life, but it's intertwined with her own journey.
Mm.
When Edith Stein, who today some want to see made and recognized as a doctor of the church, read the life of St. Teresa in one night, one stormy night when she was a guest at some Protestant's house, she closed the book and said, "This is the truth. This is the truth." It's an impressive work that's been read by so many. St. Francis de Sales read it. He was a great devotee of St. Teresa, who came a generation later. I guess I've lost my train of thought. Going back to the prayer, it's not as methodical and systematic as you might find in the spiritual exercises. However, she was very much helped by the Jesuits. And I would say, although some of my colleagues might differ, I'm pretty sure I'm on good grounds with this, but her first biographer was a Jesuit, Francisco Rivera, and he says that she did the spiritual exercises, or at least some part of them. And my own reading, and I'm quite familiar with the spiritual exercises also, there's a lot of terms in her own exposition of this interior life that you can see reflect something of the spiritual exercises. And yet, some Carmelites would be aghast at thinking that she, was a Jesuit or she followed the spiritual exercises, because they are so methodical, so classically discursive, and mental prayer as discursive meditation, which is what everybody was trying to do at that time. Mental prayer was very much being promoted. The Franciscans, especially, And then with the Jesuits coming in and having this manual, everybody was into it, so to speak. So Teresa was, part of this whole movement of doing mental prayer. She's not stuck on any sort of method. You got to do it this way, but there is meditation, and chapter 22 of the life is it's a great explanation of hers on the importance of meditation and never being too far from the humanity of Christ, but allowing the Lord also to lead you to the next step, which is a more passive, more as a recipient of
Mm.
what God is doing to you rather than you trying to exercise your faculties to approach God.
Since you're talking about the mental prayer part of it, that she was influenced by the Jesuits, she describes, this prayer of union. So again, the average listener on this podcast is probably a lay woman in the church, maybe around my age, so millennial. Are we all called to those stages of prayer that she's describing? How does that, her teaching on prayer and maybe specifically prayer of union, how does that relate to a layperson in the church who's not a religious? How can we learn from her, and what's important about that teaching of prayer?
She says that union of wills is what she most desired, to be in conformity with the will of God. When she's speaking of the prayer of union, though, she's actually speaking of a mystical prayer. So your listeners should understand that it's not something that they can do, it's something that they can experience. What they can do is prepare themselves for it by cultivating their own relationship with the Lord through prayer. There was a great movement back when I was a young priest about centering prayer. And I don't think that would be something that Teresa would be all that keen about. She didn't think we should, sit passively. She does believe that we should reflect. One way of doing it today would be Lectio Divina,
Mm.
which is actually it's very popular today, but it's really not a whole lot different from discursive meditation, except that you use the scriptural text itself, whereas back in her day, they didn't have access to the Bible. You just meditate on Christ in the garden or something, and they would have
Mm.
points and you would reflect on them. She thought that was important, but when you move into, for instance, the prayer of quiet, you're not really able to meditate, certainly not discursively going from point to point and having these reflections in your understanding and acts of the will. You become more passive, and it's more of a gaze and then a kind of well, St. John of the Cross actually calls it a quiet, loving awareness of the presence of God. That's a very
Mhm.
simple definition of basic contemplation, a quiet, loving awareness of the presence of God. When you get to the prayer of union, you've simply just deepened that experience, and there is a kind of suspension of the faculties. So you're actually incapable of discoursing mentally. You can't reflect. You're it's almost like you're not having really experienced it myself. I don't want to claim to have experienced it. I can only just say how she describes it. It's kind of like a mental paralysis. That
Mm.
might be not a very, maybe that's not a good way to describe it, but it's like you just cannot think about anything. The Lord has infused himself into you. You're just all struck, you might say. It holds your attention and fixes your will. You're just embraced. It's a firm embrace of God. And how long it lasts, I don't know. I never could really figure out from reading her writings. Sometimes it seems to last for a long time. Sometimes it may just be a short, minutes or a quarter of an hour or something like that. But it's
Yeah,
a
no,
mystical prayer.
I think you putting it into clearer terms is helping me out here. This is probably, out of the 4 women doctors, the one I know second to least about. Hildegard being the one I feel least familiar with, but I think Teresa of Avila feels a little more distant to me because, like I told you on the phone in our pre-interview, that the doctors always felt like that I had to work my way up to it. And you're helping me understand her a little bit more and making me want to read more about her. Back to what you were saying in the beginning about her gift of friendship. I remember too reading in this book called Women of Hope. There's a quote when she was starting this more contemplative order, like you're saying, all will be friends. All do you remember what is that? What is that little line?
That comes from The Way of Perfection,
Mm,
which is she wrote that after her life. The Way of Perfection was I said the others were written by because of her spiritual directors. The Way of Perfection was written because her nuns said, "Mother, you must write these things for us," because it was monastic practice to have what you call chapters. And so every week the mother priors would, give an instruction to the community. And now they wanted her to write things down. So the Way of Perfection today is used almost like a formation manual. It's a basic guide to an introduction to the life of a Carmelite nun. And really the whole second half of it is her commentary on the Lord's Prayer, which is interesting too, because you realize the Lord's Prayer is like not something that we just do formally and liturgically and publicly. It is the template of all prayer. It's the Lord's Prayer. And she, like so many other saints who have commented on it, is able to show us how it really is the gateway to the contemplative life also.
mm.
But I have the exact quote here. When I went to Uganda, it was on the on the gateway. They have a beautiful sign at the gate, and they have that quote there. They have one from St. John of the Cross, which I'll throw out there for you too. Just there it comes. In this house, all must be friends, all must be loved, all must be held dear, all must be helped. This is the Way of Perfection, chapter 4, paragraph 7. Again, because she wanted this new form of Carmel to be more conducive to the interior life and to contemplation, but it also was a genuine community and family spirit, that they were, even though the ancient tradition of Carmel is the eremitical life on Mount Carmel, and they did emphasize a lot of silence. When they worked alone, they worked in silence, but they had recreational periods was very important to her in her community.
Mm.
And this idea of friendship with one another was very important to her. By the way, the quote that on this House of Studies in Uganda, the other quote is from St. John of the Cross, and it's from a letter of his, and this is an often quoted from him. Think nothing else but that God ordains all, and where there is no love, put love, and you will draw out love.
This idea of friendship, which you're talking about in the specific for the monastery. But I've always been fascinated by saints who are friends, or like even when you were mentioning like Edith Stein having a conversion moment, reading her life. I just have this, I guess, belief that saints come in clusters. So like the idea of friendship with saints is always so fun to see, I guess, because I look at my community and say like, oh, who of us are going to be saints, and like let's be saints together.
And
So
that's something she emphasizes in her Way of Perfection, especially, but elsewhere too. That yeah, let's be saints together. That's a very good way of putting it, and that we help each other get to heaven. And also, one who is very, very close to the Lord draws other people to the Lord. It is interesting too, even the history of the church, but in her time too, how there seems to be a clustering of saints when you think of the saintly people that she had contact with.
with St. John of the Cross, like I was actually looking up yesterday, is he a doctor of the church too? And then I
Yes, he
saw that
is.
he
Oh,
was a
yes.
doctor of the church, and I was like, wow, they're not just saint friends together, they're doctors of the church
Right.
together. And so, can you talk about, you kind of mentioned in the intro about how she recruited him? And so I know that there's like a huge age gap, really, but I mean, they really had a deep friendship and they really worked together with the female and the male order. So, what was that like them meeting together and coming together to do this beautiful thing for the church at the time?
He was born in 1542, so do the math. He was born in 1515. She got permission. I believe it was under inspiration of the Lord. It was a pretty bold thing to seek to make a foundation of men, but she got permission from the general of the order to make a foundation for men. Of course, it meant that she had to recruit some man to actually
Mm.
do it. So she had the permission to initiate it and to make it happen. But, she wasn't going to be living with the men, of course. All she could do is put the thing in motion. She had to recruit, and she went to the monastery in Medina del Campo. And I guess because she was nearby with their foundation, and she talked to two friars there. One was Fray Antonio, who was quite a bit older than John of the Cross, more Teresa's age, and John of the Cross. And the famous interview was that the way it's told is that he had been wanting to become a Carthusian for a while. Now, this is 1567, because the foundation that they made was in late November of 1568. So I think this was already, maybe it was the spring of 68. I don't have my chronology right in front of me. My point is that he's still a very young priest, but he'd been already thinking of joining the Carthusians. He wanted a more solitary life. Teresa convinces him that he can find all that he's seeking in what she's offering. And eventually they make this foundation in a country place called Druello, got an old farmhouse basically. That's where the reform, again, I keep calling it reform. I'm one of those who like to think of it as there's something innovative. It's not just a reform, there's something new in what's
Mhm.
going on. But anyhow, that's where it began. And she appreciates him as, one of the holiest and learned man that she knows at that time. He ends up going back to the Incarnation, this is a few years later, to help that monastery because they're in a mess. And even Teresa is kind of forced by obedience to go back there and help that monastery. And John of the Cross becomes the confessor of the monastery. And that's actually the time when the two of them are most working together. It's a complicated history because the order, see, they're still part of one order. They haven't really become a different order. They're a movement within an order. The superiors of the order decide that this isn't such a good thing, and they become jealous. It's complicated. I'm trying to make it simple as I can, but the long and short of it is that they literally abduct St. John of the Cross.
Whoa.
Yeah. And they take him away from the Incarnation. They move him down to Toledo, where he spends the next 10 and a half months locked up in a monastery jail. Yeah, they had jails and monasteries at that time.
Wow.
And there's a lot of chaos going on with this new movement because already the Teresa's got a number of her own foundations of the nuns, and the friars have a few going too. So this is a great disturbance. They're trying the order in Spain. The superiors are now, with the collaboration of the papal nuncio, is trying to suppress, say, enough is enough. The jig's up. We're not going to do this anymore, and they try to suppress it. So
Wow.
yeah,
Oh,
there's that whole part of the story.
okay, so that part of the story I've never heard, but what you're highlighting to me is that this great thing that they were doing together, it received some backlash. It received
Uh,
they experienced a lot of turbulent waters.
right, it was not smooth sailing.
No.
Of course, and Teresa saw that as, like I just said, par for the course. That's just the way it goes. There's funny stories about that at the end of, her life in her last foundation. It was a wintry, and the rivers were flooded, and crossing them, traveling in Spain in those days was horrible, but they were stuck and it was miserable. And she says, Lord, how could you let this happen? I've suffered enough for you. And he says, this is Teresa, this is how I treat my friends. And she says to him, Lord, if this is the way you treat your friends, it's no wonder you have so few.
Yeah, and that's another thing about Saint Teresa. I mean, she's definitely seen as very funny to
Yeah,
most people. And like even you're saying, she did a lot of her writings under obedience, like which I think she references in her writings too. Like, I don't know what I have to say, but I'm doing this because I'm being obedient. Like some people see it as, very pious and humble, and certainly that's got to be there. But I think it's funny. I think it's funny that she saw it like that too.
there's a book called, it's very, very interesting how this reading of it, it's called Teresa of Avila, The Rhetoric of Femininity. It's actually a very good book. You might think it's too heavy on feminism, but there's a lot of truth in that because the famous bishop who said she's a contumacious gadabout. Even the Discalced friars who didn't even want to recognize her as the mother foundress, some of them, other clerics who didn't think women should have a place, certainly not a doctor of the church, by the way. She is the first doctor of the church, so that even the
True.
church had trouble with giving women that title. This is a very interesting thing about her. Did you know that she was the first woman doctor of the church?
I did know that. So this is going to be actually the first episode that I publish.
It was 1970, and it was Pope Paul VI who finally, authorized, because it's only the Pope can declare a saint. By the way, every doctor of the church is already a saint, and a doctor of the church has to do with a wisdom teaching. You have to be a saint, which means that you have to be sanctified, full of grace, and the gifts of the Holy Spirit are very operative, particularly the gifts of wisdom. And so it's really the wisdom of the saint that is expounded upon, in a way that instructs the faithful, that merits them the title of doctor of the church. And yet, she's the first woman doctor. So there, even in the church, there was well, women shouldn't speak in the church. So imagine how it actually was in the 16th century. And yet she won over so many men. Even in the next century, she died in 1582, but early in the next century, they're already portraying her in art and iconography with a beretta on her head. And the University of Salamanca, elects her as a doctor for their university. So her wisdom was right. And I mentioned St. Francis of Sales, who is himself a doctor of the church. He drew so much on Teresa and her prayer, because he was a great teacher of the spiritual life also. And then later on, Alphonse Liguori, they say that it was because of Alphonse Liguori, who quotes her so much in his teachings on prayer, that it enhanced her status as a
Mm.
worthy doctor of the church, because Alphonse Liguori, of course, is also a doctor of the church. So it was these doctors who, because of their use of Teresa, gave credence to the possibility that she could even be recognized as a doctor of the church. But she's still, in her time, because she's a woman and she has no theological degree, she hasn't had the academic title of doctor. And you think of the great Dominican professors and John of the Cross who went to Salamanca. I mean, the kind of learning that they went through, which was very rigorous and maybe in some ways much better than what we get today. But it was Thomistic too, Augustinian. She didn't have any of that kind of learning. And then she's having these mystical experiences. And because of Illuminatism, that whole movement that was very questionable and actually denounced, because it was Gnosticism and all that was going on. And so here this woman is having these mystical experiences, which are extraordinary. There were people that had real serious questions about her. She was authentic. She wasn't like she was being strategic. She was being herself, but she was also wise and prudent, and she had a brain on her head. She knew how to handle the situation. And she wasn't afraid of the Inquisition, although the Inquisition did go after her. She knew that she was a daughter of the church. And that's her last words, I die a daughter of the church. She was a very, very faithful Catholic. She would never go against anything that the church taught, which is why she was so insistent on having the spiritual directors and the confirmation of her directors for anything that she undertook. And she suffered too, because clerics were, the first directors that she had were lay. I mean, they were diocesan priests in Avila, and even a layman, and they caused her a lot of suffering because they said it was diabolical what was going on.
Mm.
And she was confused because it seemed so much like the Lord, but she didn't want to, trust herself. And it was a great, great suffering for her to be told that she was under the influence of the devil.
Mm.
It wasn't until the Jesuits came that they relieved her. They gave her, the green light, so to speak, that it's okay, what's happening is good. Because they had again, the discernment of spirits of Saint Ignatius.
Hmm.
They used that and it helped.
Man, this is so cool. I love the historical context that you're giving because I feel like I'm learning so much right now. You said that a bishop had called her a gadabout, which I had to look up because I think that's hilarious and I want to read that later. But just to give her some other titles, like she called herself daughter of the church, some other things that she has been called. Benedict the 15th said Teresa had united to the crown of holiness, the wreath of doctrine. So you were talking about that wisdom. Pius the 11th called her, let me see if I can pronounce this correctly, Sapientissimam Matrem, Mother Most
Mother of
Wise.
Wisdom. Yeah,
Hmm. And he also called her Altissimam Contemplationes Magistra, Supreme Teacher of Contemplation.
right,
And then John the 23rd called her the singular light of the church. Singular light
right.
of the church. So I
Well,
just
you've
love.
got quotes that I never saw. And all that leads up to Paul the Sixth
Hmm.
actually giving her, and I always like to add, for the sake of the Catherine of Siena, who I love, Catherine of Siena was made a doctor the next week.
Oh,
The
wow. I
next
didn't realize
week,
they were that close together. That's awesome.
it was intentional to give her the precedence of as the first woman doctor.
Yeah, no, that's so cool. She's just seems so amazing. Thank you so much for your expertise and teaching. Is there anything else about her life or her lived theology that you want to share with us?
The thing that she sought more than anything was conforming to God's will. You asked, are all people called to the prayer of union? She didn't want people to hold back. I mean, she wanted them to desire great things and have determination. But I'm not sure she would say that all people are called to the heights of mystical prayer. More important to her was union with God's will,
Mm,
union with God's will. Now, there's actual theological disputes about, is everyone called to mystical prayer? And there are theologians who have different opinions on that. You know, after all my years, I tend to think that no, not everyone's called to mystical prayer, but everyone is called to be a saint and to conform their will to God as much as they can. The thing is, mystical prayer helps bring that about more rapidly and maybe more profoundly. She did become a kind of a spiritual director to others. She wrote a lot of letters. Her brother Lorenzo came home from Ecuador after being away for 34 years, and she writes letters to him. There's quite a nice collection of letters to him where she gives him a lot of spiritual direction, and she's very practical. She was not a person who wanted extraordinary ascetical practices or exaggerated piety. You know, there's stories about that. They're probably apocryphal, but you know, one nun wanted not to spend so much time in recreation, and Teresa, well, go to your room and pray while the rest of us make merry with the Lord, you know, in our community recreation. Teresa was not a great fan of exaggerated piety and big ascetical practice, but she did appreciate holiness in its various forms. I mean, she loves Saint Peter of Alcantara, who helped her so much. He was a gnarled old oak tree, she says. I mean, he was, you know, he didn't sleep much. He slept on the floor. He didn't eat much. He was a bona fide aesthetic of the first class, and she never criticized him.
hmm.
But she didn't imitate him either. You know, there's a lot of exaggerated things like that in Spain. Asceticism was really exaggerated. Doing extraordinary things, and she didn't imitate those people. She might have
Mm,
admired them. She was even willing to say, well, they're holy, and you know, I'm just what I am, but she didn't imitate them, and she didn't want her nuns to be like that.
mm.
Kind of a, I would say, in a sense, a more Jesuit influence. They had a more moderated asceticism. Doing God's will was the most important thing. And friendship with Christ, you know. When you read her writing, the love is just so incredible. Her mystical experience in describing that love, you can compare it to St. John of the Cross. Well, they're both tremendous lovers of God, and that fire of charity is could burn up the whole world. So she's not a lightweight by any means. But there's a humanity about her, and she loved the humanity of Christ so much. She's a great promoter of devotion to the humanity of Christ. She wanted to be close to her friend and beloved and her spouse, Jesus Christ, the man who was God, the God man. She also loved St. Joseph very much. She's a great promoter of St. Joseph.
I think that's beautiful. I love the devotion to Christ's humanity because I
That's
think,
a
yeah.
really if I had to, if you said, is there one thing, I would say that is the one thing about Teresa's prayer life that is so important. Do not try to circumvent the humanity of Christ. The only way to God and to a deep interior life is through the humanity of Christ. So be close to Christ in his humanity, who, of course, that's God.
And what a beautiful thing to kind of start the Triduum with. This is going to come out on Holy Thursday. So, starting the Triduum with this great saint who had that devotion to his humanity, to see that he suffered everything that he suffered through his humanity. There's a very like he's the incarnation, not just at his birth. He's in the incarnation all the way till his death, and he gifts us our humanity, and he shares it with us. And so I love that going into Holy Week. So thank you again for sharing
Okay,
so much about Saint Teresa. Would you mind closing us with a prayer?
okay. Well, Lord, as we draw close to you, especially in your suffering and death, fill us with a spirit of love and patience and obedience and humility, so that we can truly imitate you who hung upon the cross for us, and help us imitate you in your saints also, and especially with Saint Teresa, that she may help us be close to you as a friend, a lover, and a teacher. We, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.